Welcome to Fanfic Nation, where worlds are rewritten, heroes defy their destiny, and what if becomes legend. From epic conflicts to unseen paths, this is the nation of fan-made stories. This novel is written by JD 787. Aegor was grateful for Oberyn's mercy during the duel, but now that he had surrendered and the outcome was decided, he should count himself lucky that Oberyn hadn't mocked or humiliated him. As the Prince of Dawn, why would he bother flattering him? How could a mere logistics officer of the Night's Watch with mediocre martial skills be qualified to discuss life with him? Wasn't this a little too strange? Aegor looked at Oberyn in confusion, only to see the prince wink at him again. Suddenly, a thought struck him. Oberyn was known for certain preferences. Could it be? Well, the Night's Watch has been busy lately, so I won't trouble you. We'll have a chance to discuss this after the battle. Aegor felt a chill run down his spine and quickly excused himself. He hadn't traveled through time and space just to end up violated. No one could stop an opponent from surrendering. Though the onlookers clamored for the fight to continue, they eventually let Aegor leave the training yard. Suppressing his unease, he forced himself to walk off the field, only to run into Yoren, who was approaching him. Before leaving King's Landing to join the royal army, he had written to the Wall, requesting that they send someone to take over his tedious duties as a Night's Watch officer. But the Watch was as miserly as ever. They refused to send even one extra man south. Instead, they had Yoren come alone, forcing him to juggle both roles. If Robert managed to break through the Bloody Gate, Yoren would be responsible for escorting the black-clad lords of the Just Alliance back to the Wall. And if the rebellion failed, well, either way they planned to ask Aegor for another batch of recruits, so it would be a win-win situation. Although Aegor knew why Yoren had come, he had just surrendered in the ring under the pretense of entertaining his comrades. With who knew how many people still watching him, he had no choice but to keep up appearances. Yoren, you must had a rough journey. Aegor greeted him with a bright smile, holding his breath as he pulled the older man into a hug. When did you get here? Just now. This camp is massive. I thought it'd take some time to find you, but turns out you're a celebrity. All I had to do was ask around. Yoren was taken aback by Aegor's uncharacteristic enthusiasm, but he didn't dwell on it. He assumed the younger man was simply enjoying his comfortable life in the south and was in high spirits. You brat, living the good life, huh? You even have time for tournaments? It had been months since they last saw each other, and Yoren was as unkempt as ever. He was still wearing the summer clothes Aegor had bought him back in King's Landing, likely the only warm weather attire he owned. He looked Aegor up and down with a grin. Oh no, wait, I should be calling you Chief Logistics Officer now. Forget that title, it sounds ridiculous. Aegor was eager to leave. He grabbed Yoren and hurried toward his tent. You came at the perfect time. I'll leave this place to you. I need to get back to King's Landing and start training new recruits as soon as possible. Yoren raised a brow. Training new recruits? That's Mormont's job, isn't it? Why would he need you for that? And if you're handling it, what's the point of keeping Sir Alistair? It's complicated, Aegor said. You know how hard it is to recruit men. The Watch is desperate for new blood, so I decided to hire some help. He led Yoren through the Antlers camp, gradually leaving the tournament grounds behind. But the commander-in-chief is worried that hiring outsiders would affect morale, so he set a rule: they can't be taken to Castle Black for training. TN, I have been using Deerhorn, Staghorn, which should have been Antlers. Sorry about that. Which means if they go to the Wall untrained, they'll just die, Yoren concluded. Exactly. And I can't afford to hire mercenaries, so I have to train them myself. I see. The plan was set in motion a while ago. But then King Robert ordered me to serve as a Night's Watchman with the army. I wasted months on this nonsense and haven't even begun training the recruits. Aegor's frustration was evident, but with an antler soldier leading the way, he forced himself to hold back from complaining too much. Thankfully, you are here now. I can finally free up my hands and try to send some men your way before you head back. As the two Night's Watchmen walked, they spoke in hushed tones about the situation at the Wall. from Yoren, Aegor learned that the Rangers were already attempting to capture Whites, though they had made little progress. That was good news. Without stopping, they soon arrived back at Aegor's tent. Thank you for your trouble. Here, take this and buy yourself some wine. Igor smiled at the soldier who had led Yoren to him, slipping a few silver stacks into his hand before ushering the Yoren into the tent. I'll be leaving for King's Landing soon. You'll stay here, Aegor told Yoren before tilting his head slightly and giving an order. Casey, pack my personal belongings. Don't bother with anything that can be bought in King's Landing. Leave those for Yoren. If they set out in the afternoon, they would reach the crossroads inn before nightfall. The road back to King's Landing was a wide and open King's Road with plenty of villages and towns along the way. Lodging and food wouldn't be an issue. Yes, sir. Casey had just watched his master fight toe-to-toe with the famous Prince of Dawn, and his admiration for Aegor was at an all-time high. He worked even harder now, eager to serve. When you're done, go saddle the horses and wait for me outside the tent. Yes, sir. That kind of task could be left to the boy. Aegor's hands were still a bit numb from the duel. He wanted to help but couldn't. With everything settled, he led Euron back out of the tent. Anyway, your safety, food, and lodging are now the responsibility of Lord Buckwell. Before I leave, I'll take you to meet him. But first, I'll show you around the camp so you know where the temporary market is. If you ever want good food, a warm bath, or other entertainment, you'll find it all there. Temporary market? Yoren chuckled. I'll pass. I might know where it is, but I don't have the coin to waste. That's fine. The Night's Watch isn't short on money these days. Aegor smirked. I'll cover your expenses until you head back to the Wall. Since Mormont had sent Yoren on this errand, it was likely they'd be working together in the future. The old crow was rough around the edges, but he wasn't a bad sort. It was worth spending a few coins to build goodwill. How many men are in this camp? Yoren asked as he followed Aegor, his eyes widening as he took in the sheer size of the army. He had never seen so many soldiers in one place. The king has such a massive force. If he sent even a fraction of them to the Wall, it'd be a game changer. Why does he have us scrambling to recruit men? Most of the soldiers weren't Roberts, but Aegor had no interest in explaining the intricacies of noble politics to a man like Euron. It would be a waste of breath. There are about 40,000 left now. If you include the logistics personnel, the total is closer to 60,000, Aegor said with a helpless shrug. And that's only because we are fighting on home soil, where we don't need as many camp followers and supply lines aren't being harassed. There were even more men before the army split up. But no matter how many there are, none will be sent to the Wall. There's loot, ransoms, and war reparations to be gained from taking the Bloody Gate. What reward is there for fighting wildlings at the edge of the world? Aegor scoffed. Guarding the Wall is a thankless task. That's why it's dumped on us Black Brothers. But enough of this bullshit. Let's just focus on fending for ourselves. Come on, I'll take you to see Lord Buckwell. Most of the soldiers from Antler's castle recognized Aegor. They knew their lord held this night's watchman in high regard, so when they saw him approaching, they merely nodded in greeting and didn't bother stopping him. Inside the large command tent, the old lord was seated at his desk, studying what looked like a ledger. Lord Buckwell, Aegor, the elderly noble looked up and offered him a warm smile. The man beside you arrived not long ago. I sent someone to fetch you, but it seems you weren't far. Thank you for the trouble, my lord. Yoren stepped forward without hesitation. I didn't introduce myself earlier. I'm Yoren. If your dungeons at Antlers hold any scums in need of disposal, I'll take them off your hands. Do you know how hard it is to improve the Night's Watch's reputation? Could you stop calling them scum for once? Aegor rubbed his forehead, exasperated. He quickly changed the subject. My lord, the watch has sent someone to take over my post. I'll be heading back to King's Landing soon. I leave Yoren in your care. That won't be a problem, Lord Buckwell nodded. But right now, I have a bigger issue actually. The entire rebel army does. You've always been quick-witted. Why don't you take a look and tell me what you think we should do? Aegor listened patiently as Buckwell explained the situation, finally grasping the root of the trouble morale and military pay. Just two issues, yet both were complicated to resolve. When more than 30,000 men from the rebel army left camp, splitting into smaller forces of several thousand each to besiege the castles surrounding the Vale of Erin, a strange pattern emerged. No matter which castle they surrounded, the moment the rebels arrived, its defenders would immediately raise the flag of surrender before the attackers could even establish a foothold. Yet when Robert's soldiers cautiously entered these strongholds, they were stunned. Inside they found only servants, caretakers left behind to clean and guard the place. Every noble, regardless of their rank or importance, had already fled with their valuables, while Robert was still regrouping his army outside King's Landing. By now, they were likely safe deep within the Vale. It wasn't just a matter of lost plunder. The Six Kingdoms hadn't marched all this way just to loot, but without highborn captives, there were no hostages to ransom, no pressure to force the rebels into surrender. Robert's strategy to systematically dismantle enemy strongholds and coerce the Just Alliance into submission had utterly failed. If they refused to negotiate, there was only one option left: storm the bloody gate. And that was where the real problems began. The saying went, the first assault is strong, the second weaker, and the third is exhausted. The rebel army had been camped outside the bloody gate for 10 days, perhaps even a month. Robert himself had led several attacks in the first few days, but after that things changed. The lords feasted and drank, discussing alliances and marriages. The soldiers, bored and restless, spent their days reading their little yellow books or even brawling for entertainment. When it was their turn for battle, they'd charge forward, lose a few arrows, cause some token casualties, then withdraw. The cycle repeated every 6 days. After so many half-hearted assaults, the weaknesses of the army's structure and training became glaringly obvious. Robert was revered and feared across Westeros, but morale built on a ruler's personal charisma was fragile. Against an unyielding fortress like the Bloody Gate, hesitation became deadly. Each day that passed sapped the men's fighting spirit like water leaking from a cracked cask. If Robert had launched an all-out assault from the beginning, throwing wave after wave of men at the walls, heedless of casualties, he might already be in the Eyrie, celebrating his victory with the women of the Vale. But now, even if he wanted to rally the troops for a decisive attack, it was doubtful whether they had the will to fight. Morale, however, was the lesser of the two problems. While their fighting spirit had suffered from failed assaults, at least they hadn't endured any crushing defeats. With so many skilled commanders from the Six Kingdoms gathered here, it was still possible to restore morale. The greater issue was military pay. In Westeros, responding to a lord's call to arms was a duty, a corvée obligation. Soldiers were not normally paid wages. Instead, their rewards came from spoils of war, land grants, tax exemptions, or promotions based on merit. With the exception of personal guard and standing armies, most levies raised during wartime received no pay at all. Wealthier lords might provide weapons and armor, but poorer ones, like those in the north, expected their men to bring their own. Peasants fought for their lords essentially for free until victory was achieved. This system, while seemingly unfair, had its limits. Military service was only unpaid when defending one's own lands, and only for a set period. The moment a campaign extended beyond that time or crossed into foreign territory, the soldiers had to be paid. This time, the armies of the Six Kingdoms had marched far from home, fighting not for their own lords but for King Robert and Lord Arryn. That meant not only had the lords borne the costs of travel and supplies, but now, after weeks of campaigning, their men were overdue for wages. Each kingdom had its own conscription rules, ranging from 40 to 60 days of unpaid service. Aegor had been too busy advancing the Night's Watch's interest to keep track of time, but the truth was clear. This war had already gone into overtime. Soon the lords would start demanding their due. This was precisely why Robert had sent Petyr Baelish to borrow money from the Iron Bank before the war dragged on too long. It wasn't just for his own army. Every lord had the legal right to demand reimbursement for their troops' extended service. The master of coin defected. It's not exactly defection. Petyr vanished as soon as he landed in Bravos, but he didn't take the Iron Bank's loan with him. At best, you could call it fleeing to avoid consequences. The old lord sighed. It's a disaster, not just because we lost our funding. I hear the Iron Bank is planning to send envoys to King's Landing to investigate the crown's finances. Aegor wasn't surprised. Littlefinger had been many things, but he wasn't foolish enough to steal from the Iron Bank. The rulers of Bravos wanted people to fear the faceless men. Why else maintain such an infamous reputation? The threat alone was often enough to ensure compliance. Aegor shrugged. If I were the Iron Bank, I'd be nervous too if my biggest debtor suddenly lost its financial minister. It's worse than that. Littlefinger running off is as good as a confession. He's practically admitting that Liza Tully did conspire with him to murder Lord Arryn. Now even our own position is in jeopardy. Aegor nodded thoughtfully. That is troublesome. If it were me, I'd take the Just Alliance's offer and end the war with some dignity. But His Majesty the King is not you, Buckwell said with a bitter smile. Aegor laughed. He could already picture Robert's reaction in the War Council, red-faced with rage, likely flipping tables and shouting obscenities. A man like Robert would never accept such an open insult. If anything, this humiliation would only make him more stubborn, less willing to negotiate. But no matter how furious he is, Aegor mused, he doesn't have the gold, and he can't force the lords to keep their armies here once their service time is up. The rules of the game don't allow it. It's certainly not allowed, Buckwell said. Robb Stark. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's the son of the Hand of the King. At the War Council, he's already stated that he'll be sending some of the less trained peasant levies home to tend to their farms. He'll personally lead the remaining knights and elite troops to continue assisting. At the heart of it, this was a matter of productivity. Medieval society simply couldn't sustain the long-term absence of able-bodied young men who made up roughly 1% of the total population. No matter how magical this world was, certain fundamental laws still applied. The Starks are among Robert's most valued allies, and they took little for themselves after he overthrew the Targaryens. There's no reason for His Majesty to stop such a loyal and hard-working family from returning home to labor on his behalf. Aegor mused, suddenly grasping Buckwell's dilemma. Those who contributed and those who defied the king would be treated very differently. Precisely, the old lord agreed. The Starks and the Tullys have been unwavering in their support of His Majesty. He can't force them to remain without pay. The Tullys are in a slightly different position. Lady Lysa is holed up in the Eyrie, so they'll likely leave 10,000 men behind to keep the pressure up. But the Starks, they are too dutiful for that. They're keeping 5,000 here, but if they miss the planting season, people will starve in the north. Aegor's mind began to work. Let me make a guess. Half the army from the Stormlands will likely leave, but since they're the king's bannermen, his best troops will stay. The Lannisters, being his in-laws, can afford to remain, but you can be sure they'll charge every silver stag in expenses to King Robert's debt to Lord Tywin. His thoughts moved faster now, his mind no longer dulled by the tournament. The only ones likely to just walk away are the Dornish. House Martell has never cared for the Iron Throne. They send their troops here out of obligation, but the moment their conscription time expires and the king fails to pay them, they'll vanish within days. As for the Tyrells, they're desperate to worm their way into the center of power in King's Landing. They wouldn't miss this opportunity to prove their loyalty. Aegor exhaled sharply. 7 hells. Now I see why Highgarden only sent 5,000 elite troops instead of committing more men from the Reach. This way, they can put on a grand show of loyalty under the king's nose without having to shoulder a massive payroll. The rules of the game were as simple as they were crude. When the king called for war, refusing to fight branded you a traitor. But once a soldier's service time was up, staying on proved your loyalty, while leaving to tend to your lands was perfectly acceptable. Robert could resent those who left, could make things difficult for them later, but he had no grounds to accuse them of wrongdoing. The problem was that Dorne was the only kingdom in Westeros that didn't care if Robert resented them. 10,000 men had come from the north, yet half would leave before the war was won. Robert might not say it aloud, but it would surely sting. Meanwhile, Highgarden had sent only 5,000, but by standing firm to the bitter end, they could win the king's favor. Clever bastards. The politics of it all were fascinating. Aegor wondered, had the Tyrells planned this so precisely, or had they just stumbled into the perfect strategy? Your analysis is sound, Buckwell admitted, but you left out the crown lands. Aegor frowned. Our lands, the old lord clarified. Not only did we fight on the wrong side during His Majesty's rebellion, but we are directly under the authority of the Iron Throne. This is our chance to prove our loyalty and wipe away our past sins. We don't dare leave, and we certainly don't dare ask the king for military pay. Damn it. If Aegor weren't standing in front of Yoren and Buckwell, he might have slapped his own thigh in frustration. He was only now realizing that this war, with all its absurdities, had spiraled far beyond Robert's original plans. And worse, its outcome now directly affected his own interests. How long can Antler's wealth sustain this? Fortunately, the Tyrells have been supplying food and fodder, which eases some of the burden. By my calculations, we can last a month. If we start selling off property, maybe 2 months at most. Beyond that, Buckwell shook his head grimly. Forget the investment deal you proposed. Even my own family will have to borrow just to buy grain. Trouble, a huge trouble. Many of the nobles Aegor had courted as investors were from the riverlands and the crown lands. If their armies bled themselves dry solely to avoid offending Robert, then vast sums that should have gone into his projects into the Night's Watch would be swallowed by the war. The money wouldn't disappear, but once it ended up in the hands of exhausted, unpaid soldiers, it would be nearly impossible to retrieve, and that was a loss Aegor could not afford. He inhaled sharply, hissing air through his teeth as he thought. Then, after a long moment, he clenched his fist. Your position determines your perspective. If profit was on the line, then he had no choice but to intervene. Lord Buckwell, he said at last, his voice steady, I have an idea. Present it to the king at the next war council. If it works, we might be able to end this war sooner and cut our losses. Wait. Aegor had expected Buckwell to eagerly accept his proposal, but the old man surprised him by raising a hand to stop him. Aegor, you're certainly clever. I've seen it firsthand, and I have no doubt of it. But let me ask you, is your plan guaranteed to take the bloody gate? No, Aegor answered honestly. It's not about taking the bloody gate, it's about taking the Vale of Arryn as a whole. He continued, the idea comes from the history of Sena, my homeland. But given my limited knowledge of military strategy and my complete ignorance of the well-specific conditions, I can't make any guarantees. In that case, I won't present it to His Majesty, Buckwell said, shaking his head. His gaze was steady as he looked at Aegor. Don't forget, we are the king's bannermen, repaying our debts while proving our loyalty. We are not seeking glory, only avoiding failure. If your plan works, His Majesty will see it as expected of a noble lord offering counsel. He may not even be grateful. But if it fails and costs him time, he may well blame me. I have no intention of taking risks where the consequences outweigh the rewards. Aegor stroked his chin, frowning. That's reasonable. Then what should I do? If you ask me, you should advise Robert yourself, Buckwell suggested. You are an officer of the Night's Watch appointed by the king himself. If your plan fails, he can't truly blame you, and even if he does, he has no power to punish a man sworn to the wall beyond his jurisdiction. It was a sound idea. But Aegor had already decided long ago he wouldn't be the first to step forward. Advising Robert on how to crush the Val's so-called rebels, it wasn't just a matter of whether it was appropriate for a Night's Watchman to interfere in southern wars. If his plan succeeded, all would be well. But if it failed, and Robert was forced into a compromise with men like Yohn Royce, the Vale's nobility would remember who had tried to break them, and they would hold a grudge. That being said, Aegor didn't refuse outright. Months ago back in Winterfell, he had resolved not to stand out too soon, but since then, his circumstances had changed drastically. He had proven that the future could be altered, and he no longer had to walk on eggshells, constantly watching for danger. Now, the question wasn't whether he could step forward, but whether doing so would bring him more benefit or harm. Go on, Yoren urged from the side. What are you afraid of? You think Robert will lop your head off if your plan fails? You're already famous. Get a little more famous, and even Mormont won't be able to touch you. Aegor ignored the old crow's blunt words. As the chief logistics officer and founder of Night's Watch Industries, his concerns went far beyond just keeping his head on his shoulders. Author's note: this chapter trades blades for lasers, revealing how wars are won long before the first charge. Between morale, coin, and quiet ambition, Aegor begins to see that power often hides in supply lines and patience. In Westeros, the deadliest battles are not fought on walls, but in councils and calculations. He needed to weigh his options carefully. He emptied his mind and thought. Littlefinger was gone. Of the two great manipulators in King's Landing, one had fallen. That left Varys, and when it came to the Wales rebellion, Varys had no reason to stand in his way. Even if the Spider was truly loyal to the Targaryens, he would prefer Westeros to remain stable until the Targaryens were ready to return. As for the other great houses, Dorne and the Iron Islands might not care about this war, might even want the other six kingdoms to bleed themselves dry. But beyond them, no one else wanted this farce to drag on. His plan wouldn't offend any of the true power players. The only ones who might suffer were the nobles of the Righteous Alliance, and while they were formidable in the Vale, their reach ended there. As long as he stayed clear of them, they couldn't touch him, not when he was the Night's Watch's chief logistics officer, a man with a title, influence, and position. If the plan failed, he would suffer little more than embarrassment and the ire of a few petty lords. But if it succeeded, not only would he protect the wealth of potential investors, but if Robert was pleased, he might even be able to ask for something in return. Buckwell had said the risk outweighed the reward for him, but for Aegor, the reward far outweighed the risk. All right, Aegor decided. If you think I should, then I will. At that moment, as the words left his lips, he made an even bolder decision. His true ambitions would require working alongside nobles, dealing with men of far greater status and power than himself, and to deal with them, he couldn't afford to act small. Humility and meekness would only mark him as weak, someone to be used and discarded. If he couldn't yet display hard power, he would cultivate soft power instead. Becoming a known name was the first step. The next step, letting the world see that the Night's Watch's chief logistics officer was a man of intellect and foresight, someone you could profit from working with, but risk opposing. He was confident in his plan. The strategies he had drawn from history had worked before, and he judged his odds of success to be greater than 50%. Since he was going to step forward, he might as well do it in style. When's the next war council? He asked. Every morning, Buckwell said. Why, you planning to announce your plan publicly? That's right, Aegor replied. Tell His Majesty that I have a brilliant strategy. If he is willing to listen, I'll present it at the council before everyone. The time for playing it safe was over. It was time to step onto the stage. Leaving Buckwell's tent, Aegor saw Casey waiting outside his own tent, two horses saddled and ready. Sir, are we leaving now? Casey called. No, Aegor said. Take the gear down. Lead the horses back to the stable. Yoren let out a rough laugh. Tomorrow, your master's going to stir up some real trouble. Antlers wasn't about to provide Yoren with his own tent, so the two Night's Watchmen naturally shared one. Yoren, as always, was a mess, so before settling in for the night, Aegor had Casey take him for a shave, a bath, and a change of clothes. At least now, he didn't reek. The next morning, Aegor was up early, waiting outside Buckwell's tent. Once the old Earl had finished dressing, the two shared breakfast before heading toward Robert's command tent, toward the king, the war council, and the moment Aegor would make his move. Buckwell entered the tent, leaving Aegor outside, watching as the lords and commanders of the six kingdoms filed in one after another. He waited patiently. From within the tent, voices rose and fell. Robert was a loud man, and as king his voice naturally carried over everyone else's even without him shouting. Roughly 10 minutes later, Aegor heard the words, "Let him in." Kishanet, that was his cue. A tall, handsome, white-haired Kingsguard stepped out of the tent. His sharp eyes scanned the gathered men and quickly found Aegor in his black cloak. "You're Aegor West?" he asked. "Come in." Judging by his age and bearing, this had to be Sir Barristan Selmy, the living legend, the man who had once captured the faceless man Jaqen and bested the Red Viper of Dawn in single combat. Just yesterday, Igor had felt Oberyn Martell's skill firsthand. Now, standing before the knight who had defeated him, he couldn't help but study the old warrior a little longer. The thought that Selmy could probably dismantle him in moments made him uneasy. Still, he gave a nod of acknowledgement and stepped past the tent flaps. The war tent was simple in its layout. At its center was a large square table upon which lay a sand table representing the terrain around the Bloody Gate, the entrance to the Vale of Arryn. Miniature figures representing both armies were meticulously placed upon it. The scene was clear. Robert's loyalist forces outnumbered the rebels dozens of times over, their forces spread across the valley. Meanwhile, the noble houses of the Just Alliance remained within the vale surrounding the Eyrie, where Lord Arryn was trapped. The density of game pieces was highest near the Bloody Gate. More than a dozen markers represented the royalist forces encamped in the fields and hills outside the pass, while on the high ground only one piece represented the rebels. One man guarding the pass, 10,000 men cannot break through. Around the table stood the lords and commanders of the six kingdoms, excluding, of course, the Vale. The groups were clearly defined. Buckwell stood beside Robert, with the other nobles of the Crownlands gathered nearby. The Stormlanders, led by Renly Baratheon, stood together. Robb Stark and his men represented the north. The Lannisters, clad in their signature red and gold, stood apart. Ser Loras Tyrell and Randyll Tarly led the Knights of the Reach. Edmure Tully, his face grim, stood with the River Lords. Dawn had sent the smallest contingent. Oberyn Martell smirked at Aegor with his usual unreadable expression. The Lords of the Vale, unsurprisingly, were absent. Robert had dismissed them from the meeting. Stannis Baratheon and Yara Greyjoy, the charming little princess of the Iron Islands, as some called her, were also missing. As for the royal fleet, they were occupied elsewhere. "Well, well," came a familiar voice. "So this is the famous White Walker Slayer?" Robert Baratheon's voice was thick and rough. "You got a plan to break into the Vale? Let's hear it." Aegor's gaze moved to the man seated at the head of the table, the only man seated in the tent. Robert was disheveled and red-faced, a cup of wine resting before him. It was unclear whether he was still hungover from the night before or if he had already begun drinking after breakfast. It was not Aegor's first time seeing the king, but it was the first time they would speak face to face. A drunkard and a degenerate, he thought. And yet, this man is a key to keeping the Seven Kingdoms at peace. How absurd, even more absurd, that in the original timeline, Cersei Lannister the fool had poisoned Robert, thinking it was a victory in the Game of Thrones. As if removing the one man holding the realm together wouldn't send everything into chaos. If not for Tywin Lannister's military prowess and political acumen, she would have been someone else's plaything before she even realized what had happened. "Your Grace," Aegor said, choosing his words carefully. "Before I begin, allow me to ask one thing. Old habits died hard. Caution had kept him alive this long." Before he advised Robert, he needed clarity. Would my counsel violate the Night's Watch's vow of neutrality? Would offering advice to your Grace on this matter be seen as interfering in the affairs of the Seven Kingdoms? Damn Night's Watch. Robert's face grew even redder. As king, he had brought a Night's Watch officer along on a whim, confident that the Bloody Gate would fall easily. But now, with the siege dragging on, his unprecedented decision had turned into an embarrassment. If Aegor had simply remained in the Antlers camp, it would have been one thing, but instead, here he was stepping forward to advise him. Every second the man in black stood before him felt like a slap to the face. "How many times do I have to say this?" Robert bellowed, slamming his cup against the table after each word. "They are rebels, rebels, rebels." By the third outburst, the cup had cracked and red wine spilled over his hand, pooling onto the table. Snorting, Robert hurled the goblet to the floor, shattering it, then grabbed the tablecloth to wipe his hand before roaring again. I am putting down a rebellion. This is not a civil war. Do you understand? Now speak your piece or get out. And someone bring me another damn cup. Aegor froze for half a second before realizing the last command wasn't directed at him. This he supposed was what people meant when they said a king's moods were as dangerous as a tiger's. He had braced himself for Robert's temper, but witnessing it firsthand was something else entirely. For a moment he had nearly ducked, expecting the cup to come flying at his head. Fortunately, Robert had only smashed it on the ground. Unlike the Honorable Eddard Stark, not every lord in the Seven Kingdoms was reasonable or even predictable. Your Grace, calm yourself. I only needed confirmation, Aegor said quickly. Against a king like Robert, this was no time for stubbornness or bravado. What mattered was that he had received the answer he wanted. Robert had shouted rebels 3 times, loud enough for the whole war council to hear. That declaration made it clear this wasn't a civil war but a rebellion. By that definition, advising the king on how to suppress it did not violate the Night's Watch's neutrality. Technically, as a senior officer of the Watch, the fifth in command at Castle Black, Aegor's actions could only be judged by Lord Commander Mormont. Robert's words carried no real authority over him. But in the real world, authority came down to power. The man with the strongest fist made the rules, and with Robert making such a public declaration, Mormont wouldn't dare challenge what had now become an established fact. Aegor glanced around the tent. Robb Stark caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. Aegor returned the gesture, then turned his attention back to the king. In Sena, where I come from, there is a place. It is surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, with an impassable river to the east. The terrain is as treacherous as the Vale. For a long time, the only way in from the north was through a pass, an even stronger natural defense than the Bloody Gate. Yes, I get it. Randall Tarley interrupted, his tone as sharp as ever. And then someone managed to break through the gate. How? Stop telling stories and get to the point. Robert snapped impatiently. Aegor sighed inwardly. No patience at all. They really don't play by the rules. Most of his prepared speech was now useless. What should have been a carefully constructed argument had to be condensed into a blunt summary. At Thermopylae, the Persian army was held off by a mere 300 Spartans. Even after suffering thousands of casualties, they could not break through until they found another way around. Take a detour. Since Robert had no patience for the full story, Aegor skipped straight to the conclusion. Leave a large force outside the Bloody Gate to keep the defenders occupied, he said. Meanwhile, send your most elite troops through a hidden path. Once inside the Vale, you can either strike directly at the Eyrie to force a surrender, or coordinate an attack from both inside and outside to overrun the Bloody Gate itself. The choice is yours, Your Grace. Snort. Huh. The lords around the table reacted with skepticism. Some chuckled, others shook their heads. Randall Tarley remained expressionless as he coldly remarked, It's a fine strategy, if you can find such a path. Tell me, Chief Logistics Officer, do you happen to know which route leads into the Vale unseen? I don't. Do you happen to know which route? Aegor admitted. If I knew, then the rebels in the Vale would know as well, rendering it useless. What we need is a path they don't know about, or a new one carved out for this purpose. Oh well, that's easy then, Tarly said dryly. Do you think every army that has ever attempted to take the Vale over thousands of years was full of idiots? You believe you'll just find a secret path no one has before? He gestured toward the sand table, his voice laced with contempt. The mountains stretch for hundreds of miles. How long do you suppose it would take to traverse them and find such a route? A month? 2? Half a year? And what do you expect our tens of thousands of soldiers to do in the meantime? Go home and plant crops? Sit here and rot at the valley's edge? The Tyrells may be able to afford supplies for that long, but who will cover the cost of marching the army back and forth, not to mention the soldiers' pay? Lord Tarley, your question is valid, Aegor said, having anticipated the challenge. If King Robert were to summon the few Vale clans that did not join the rebellion to this council, they would tell His Grace that there are existing paths into the Vale, more than one, in fact. The only reason these routes remain unused is that they are controlled by the mountain clans who submit neither to the Eyrie nor the Iron Throne. Outsiders unfamiliar with the Vale have been misled by the claim that the only way in is through the Bloody Gate, when the truth is, if you want to take the main road into the Vale, then you must go through the Bloody Gate. Exposing a flaw in thinking was easy. The challenge lay in how to exploit it. Taking a detour was not as simple as just deciding to do so. He paused briefly before revealing his final answer. But if the goal is simply to end the war, there is no need to capture the Bloody Gate. My proposal is this. Keep the main army encamped outside the pass, continuing daily feints with stones and arrows. Meanwhile, send a few thousand elite soldiers with limited supplies into the mountains to subdue the mountain clans. Once they are forced into submission, these men who know the terrain will guide our forces through the mountain passes and into the Vale. Then the war will be won. To avoid arousing suspicion, these elite troops should be disguised as levies being dismissed to return home for the harvest. They will appear to be retreating from the battlefield, but in reality they will slip into the mountains. The rebels will never suspect that the troops we leave behind are mostly raw recruits and camp followers, while the battle-hardened veterans have already vanished. By the time they realize what has happened, it will be too late. The plan sounded straightforward, but in reality, it incorporated multiple strategic and tactical principles, feinting in one direction while striking in another, disguising movement, misdirection, and deception. In the modern world, such a plan would be considered obvious. But in Westeros, where military command was often dictated by raw courage rather than strategy, this was a stroke of brilliance. To come up with such a detailed plan in a single day, was Aegor truly a military genius? Not necessarily. The truth was, the moment he had first laid eyes on the Bloody Gate and noticed its similarities to the pass, his mind had already begun working on how to break through it. And when he realized that this war was directly tied to his own interests, the answer had already been waiting for him. The tent fell silent. A moment ago, when Aegor had first mentioned taking a hidden path, most of the lords had scoffed or sneered. But now, after hearing the full plan, who could argue? A slender, well-dressed squire approached, setting a fresh cup of wine before Robert, but for once the king did not drink. Seated at the head of the table, Robert drummed his thick fingers against the wood, his expression unreadable. The flush of alcohol had faded slightly from his face. He had wanted to be the first king in 1,000 years to break through the Bloody Gate by force. But with Petyr Baelish's betrayal and the royal coffers nearly empty, a direct assault would be too costly. He knew that much. After nearly a minute of silence, he finally spoke. "What do you lot think?" he asked gruffly. "Does the White Walker Slayer's plan work?" "I believe it does," Randall Tarley said without hesitation. His tone remained stern, but his stance had shifted. If he hadn't mentioned it, how many in this tent would have remembered that the mountain clans of the Vale do not answer to the Eyrie? Then, turning his sharp gaze to Aegor, he added, "Tell me, Lord Aegor West, I hear you came from overseas, and that you were shipped to the Wall the moment you arrived. So, how is it that you seem to understand the Vale better than those of us born and raised in Westeros?" Aegor smiled. "There is a thing called a book, my lord." He had no intention of telling them that the book in question was A Song of Ice and Fire, nor that his strategy had been drawn from the history of Earth. "There is also a saying," he continued smoothly, "you need not leave your home to know all the world." "Your Grace, I also find the plan feasible." Robb Stark was the first to voice his support. The North is home to many clans and tribes. The Karstarks and Umbers have long dealt with such people. Furthermore, the mountain clans of the Vale share the same first-man blood as we do and still worship the old gods. They would be more willing to submit to Northerners than to Southerners. I volunteer to lead the North's forces for this operation. Dorne has mountains as well, Your Grace. Oberyn Martell chimed in smoothly. Most of my spearmen are accustomed to scaling cliffs and ridges. With a proper guide, they could be put to excellent use. With a concrete plan on the table, the noble houses rushed to volunteer. Not necessarily because they were confident in its success, but because no matter how difficult it was to march through the mountains of the moon, it was still better than being sent to die at the bloody gate. Very well, White Walker Slayer. Robert exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if a great burden had been lifted. His voice had lost its earlier aggression, returning to its usual boisterous ease. Let's see if your idea actually works. If it does, there will be a great reward. Then, smirking, he added, and if it fails, well, I suppose I'll have to swallow my pride and talk to these rebels. A convenient way to shift all responsibility onto Aegor. If the plan succeeded, Robert could take the credit. If it failed, he could blame the Night's Watch officer for wasting his time. Clever. Now, Robert continued, waving a hand. You may go. The rest of you stay. We have details to sort out. Are the mountain clans truly difficult to deal with? Not particularly. They are poorly armed, malnourished, and untrained, little different from the wildlings beyond the wall. So why had the rulers of the Vale never eradicated them? The answer was the same as why the Night's Watch had never wiped out the free folk. In theory, a few thousand well-trained soldiers, not even particularly elite, just fighters of Aegor's caliber, could slaughter the hundreds of thousands of wildlings beyond the wall, driving the survivors into the land of always winter. But where would those thousands of soldiers come from? How long would it take to hunt the wildlings to extinction? Who would pay for the soldiers' provisions and wages during the campaign? What about the pensions for those who died resisting the free folk? And after the wildlings were gone, what purpose would the wall serve, other than giving the Seven Kingdoms criminals and exiles a free place to rot? The mountain clans were far fewer in number than the free folk, but they had the advantage of terrain. They lived in the mountains, had no fixed settlements, and relied on guerrilla tactics, making them even harder to eradicate. In the end, the reason was simple: the cost of eliminating the mountain clans far outweighed the benefits. Instead of investing resources in exterminating them, it was easier for the Vale's lords to simply travel with an armed escort whenever they passed through the mountains. As long as a group had 10 or more armed men, the clans rarely dared to attack. Ultimately, it was a question of productivity. These three words defined the limits of human ambition. No matter how grand the vision, reality forced people to make pragmatic choices in order to survive in this harsh world. On the day Aegor presented his strategy, the war council ran longer than usual. After many lords and commanders departed Robert's tent and returned to their camps, the army finally began to move. An hour or two later, units ranging in size from dozens to hundreds began to leave the encampment, marching toward the bloody gate. To the defenders watching from the high walls, it looked like an internal dispute had broken out, levies being dismissed early, returning home for the harvest. But once out of sight, these soldiers took a long detour, slipping into the mountains of the moon to track down the mountain clans. The poor clans had done nothing to provoke this. The moment Robert's rebellion army arrived, they had fled deep into the mountains, staying hidden and starving for over a month rather than risking conflict. They had wanted no part in the war. And yet, thanks to the suggestion of a single outsider, a man from another world, hundreds of elite scouts and soldiers trained in woodland and mountain warfare were now coming for them. Aegor had initially planned to return to King's Landing after delivering his advice, but when Buckwell returned from the War Council, he brought news that changed his mind. Robert had finalized the strategy and set a deadline. The infiltration force would coordinate an attack with the main army. If the Bloody Gate did not fall within 2 weeks, Robert would negotiate peace with the Righteous Alliance. In such a hopeful situation, Aegor decided to remain. If his plan led to victory, he might even receive a reward. Offering advice to the Iron Throne while wearing the black of the Night's Watch was already a serious breach of tradition. Personally participating in military action, that was something Aegor would never dare. So, he remained in the main camp with no way of knowing how his plan was unfolding. The troops sent into the mountains couldn't maintain communication with the coalition camp, leaving the entire operation a black box, a gamble whose outcome could only be waited on. Each day, the staged siege at the Bloody Gate continued, while the rest of the coalition army remained at the ready. Outwardly, the camp appeared relaxed. In reality, every force was in a constant state of preparedness. Buckwell had summed it up best. As soon as the signal comes, the army will charge forward and take the bloody gate. But what was the signal? When would it appear? Even Buckwell couldn't say. As the days passed, Aegor's confidence wavered. Had he overestimated himself? The mountain clans existed, and they might know hidden paths into the Vale, but could Robert's elite troops actually track them down? Would the paths be passable? Would there be just alliance forces waiting at the other end? He had assumed these things based on history, placing his faith in records from books. But this wasn't his world, and history didn't always repeat itself. For the first time, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on him. That doubt lingered until the sixth day after his proposal. That afternoon, Aegor had been drinking with Buckwell, listening to the old man complain about military pay and the impact of war on his lands. Then suddenly the call of a war horn echoed across the camp, a long, distant blast. The ground trembled. Shouts erupted from all around. Horses neighed in alarm. The heavy thud of hoofs rumbled through the earth. "What's happening?" Buckwell and Aegor rushed outside, calling to the nearest soldiers. A breathless man turned to them. "My lord, a signal has been received. Full assault ordered. Bring the siege ladders." There was no need to ask more. The screams and battle cries rising from the bloody gate told the story. For days, the staged sieges had followed the same pattern. An army would march up, go through the motions of an attack, and then withdraw. The space before the pass would be empty once they were done. But today, battle cries still echoed from that space, meaning there were soldiers already inside. The infiltrators had made it through. "Damn it, Aegor, stay here in camp." Buckwell snapped, already moving. "Robert will be leading the charge himself. This is the perfect time to earn merit." With that, the old earl rushed toward the assembling men of antlers, barking orders as the chaotic mass of soldiers scrambled to form ranks. Author's note: this chapter is where thought sharpens into action. Aegor steps out from the margins and into the floodlight, wagering reputation against results, theory against blood. Here, wars are not won by shouting the loudest or swinging the hardest, but by seeing what others overlook and daring to act before certainty arrives.
Hold your ground, find your commanding officers, don't drop your weapons, maintain formation. The king is already leading the cavalry charge. 7 hells, whatever happens, keep moving forward, don't break rank, follow those ahead and don't lose your swords and armor. What does it look like when tens of thousands charge at once? Aegor soon found out. Yoren, drawn outside by the commotion, joined him. As Night's Watchmen, they were the only ones in the coalition camp who could watch the battle without worrying about earning merit. They climbed a small hill near the Antlers camp, looking down at the battlefield. At the front of the charge, Robert Baratheon led the cavalry himself. No one dared compete with the king for the honor of first blood. The white cloaks of the Kingsguard flanking him gleamed in the sunlight as they rode like a spearhead straight toward the bloody gate. The usual rain of arrows and stones from the defenders was conspicuously absent. Those still manning the walls were too busy fighting off the real threat now striking from the rear. Behind the cavalry came a wave of infantry. Their formation was all but non-existent. With so many officers and veteran soldiers sent into the mountains, the remaining peasant levies were a disorganized mess. On an ordinary day, such a chaotic assault would have been suicidal, but today it didn't matter. As long as they ran fast enough, scaled the walls, and reinforced the infiltrators before the defenders could push them back, the battle would be over. "Gods," Aegor muttered under his breath. The idea of a king personally leading a charge might seem romantic in this era, but to a man from another world it was reckless, a relic of an age where leaders had no choice but to fight because their troops lacked discipline. "Robert, don't get yourself killed." "Don't worry," Yoren said. "I've not seen many battles, but I've seen enough to know when an army gets hit from behind without warning, the fight is already over." The cavalry thundered through the filled trenches and reached the bloody gate's walls. Robert and the Kingsguard, along with more of the king's cavalry, dismounted. They had reached the battlefield first, but they couldn't scale the walls without ladders. The solution appeared almost immediately. Scattered at the base of the walls were siege ladders, left behind after failed assaults days prior. Blood-stained, caked in mud but still usable. Under the distant gaze of the 2 Night's Watchmen and Aegor's servant Casey, a white-cloaked figure was the first to ascend, reaching the top of the bloody gate. Then a second figure, a large, unmistakable shape, Robert Baratheon himself. By the time the second and third ladders were raised, it no longer mattered. The battle was already decided. The screams of war began to fade. There was no deep hatred between the bloody gate's defenders and Robert's army. Many had likely fought side by side during the usurper's war. Seeing the banners fall, realizing their position was overrun, they chose the only path left to them. Surrender. Less than half an hour later, the banners of the Righteous Alliance were torn down. In their place, a crowned stag flew high above the bloody gate. The bloody gate had fallen, but the process had unfolded in a completely unexpected manner. Due to unforeseen complications, Aegor's plan to send elite troops into the mountains to hunt down and subdue the mountain clans did not go as smoothly as anticipated. These clansmen had taken guerrilla tactics to the extreme. Familiar with the terrain, they avoided direct confrontation and instead relied on hit-and-run tactics, never engaging Robert's forces head-on. Their scouts spotted approaching soldiers from a distance and immediately fled with their families and belongings, vanishing into the wilderness before the army could even close in. Despite sending thousands of men into the mountains over several days, not a single captive was taken. If this continued, the 15-day deadline given by Robert would prove impossible to meet. Just as the campaign seemed to be stalling, Robb Stark's forces unexpectedly encountered an old yet formidable figure, Brynden Tully, better known as the Blackfish, the younger brother of Hoster Tully, Lord of Riverrun. Years ago, due to disagreements with his brother, Brynden had left the Riverlands and gone to the Vale to serve Lysa Arryn. Her husband Jon Arryn had appointed him as the Knight of the Bloody Gate, entrusting him with guarding the Vale's most important pass. When the so-called Alliance of the Righteous launched their rebellion, Brynden had attempted to rally his men and resist, but the situation quickly proved untenable. Knowing the battle was lost, he made a swift retreat, escaping through a secret passage within the Bloody Gate and disappearing into the Mountains of the Moon. He had spent over a month evading the mountain clans when by sheer luck he crossed paths with Robb Stark, who was searching the mountains. Having defended the Bloody Gate for over a decade, Brynden may not have been an expert in breaching it from the front, but when it came to finding a way around to its rear, few in Westeros could match his knowledge. The true former commander of the garrison led a force of several hundred elite soldiers through the hidden mountain paths, as if he were strolling through his own keep, slipping past enemy lines unnoticed, until they began scaling the gate tower itself. In the end, while Aegor's strategy had paved the way for Robert's victory, the true credit belonged to a man who had never set foot in the rebel camp or attended a single war council. This was hardly surprising. In the television series, Brynden had escaped the Red Wedding by leaving to relieve himself. In the books, he had vanished from Riverrun before its surrender to Jaime Lannister. Though the world of ice and fire had been altered by countless ripples of fate, his uncanny ability to slip away unscathed remained unchanged. Aegor mused that Blackfish was an ill-fitting name for him, perhaps Loach would be more appropriate. Once the Bloody Gate was secured, it took only half a day for the rebels to clear the blocked passage. Hundreds of men worked in shifts, digging from both inside and out, completing the task far sooner than expected. Upon hearing this, Aegor couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. When Robert's forces took the Bloody Gate, they discovered that the defenders had already cleared most of the passage themselves. Captured prisoners revealed that the work had begun the moment the rebel army appeared to disband. Had the flanking force failed to intercept the original garrison of the Bloody Gate, or if Brynden Tully's detour had been delayed by just a few days, the rebel army stationed at the valley's entrance might have faced a devastating nighttime assault. A scenario was easy to imagine, a camp of tens of thousands. Made up of men from different banners, lacking experienced commanders, battle-hardened veterans, and knightly discipline, if attacked in the dead of night, the outcome would have been nothing short of catastrophic. Even non-combatants like Aegor and Yoren might not have escaped unscathed. Fortunately, history has no room for ifs. With the Bloody Gate secured, the entire Vale lay open before them. The 1,000-odd rebels stationed at the valley and the foot of the Giant's Lance quickly realized their position was hopeless. Seeing that the gate had fallen, they surrendered without hesitation. Within 2 days, the entirety of the Vale had fallen into Robert's hands. The only remaining stronghold was the Eyrie itself. However, reaching it required passing through the Gates of the Moon, another formidable fortress. This castle, too, was held by a member of House Royce, though not of the same branch that had pledged loyalty to the rebels. When Robert's forces arrived at the Gates of the Moon, they found that its lords had yet to declare open support for the Alliance of the Righteous, nor had the castle fallen into enemy hands. This was a fortunate turn of events. Beyond the Gates of the Moon lay the final obstacle, the winding, treacherous path leading up to the Eyrie. The ascent, even under normal circumstances, took half a day. Along the way, attackers would be exposed to enemy fire from not only the Eyrie itself but also its 3 satellite strongholds, Stone, Snow, and Sky. The good news was that the commanders of these fortresses had refrained from officially siding with the rebels. While they may have once sympathized with the cause or even secretly supported it, the arrival of Robert's combined army, bearing the stag banner of House Baratheon, had swiftly reminded them of their true loyalties. Lysa Arryn, however, refused to accept reality. She remained holed up in the Eyrie, unwilling to descend. Yet with supplies dwindling inside the castle, the outcome of this rebellion, which had shaken the Seven Kingdoms for nearly 2 months, was already clear. It was only a matter of time before it came to its inevitable anticlimactic end. The victory feast was held in a field within the Vale of Arryn, overlooking the towering peak of the Giant's Lance. By day the view was breathtaking. Majestic mountains stretched across the horizon, and the ghostly torrent known as Alyssa's Tears cascaded from the heights of the western range. The silvery stream gleamed in the sunlight, starkly contrasting against the dark, jagged cliffs. By night, this tranquil place became the setting for the largest bonfire celebration in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. With the fall of the Bloody Gate, the vast wealth and supplies that the lords of the so-called Alliance of the Righteous had hidden throughout the Vale were now seized as spoils of war. Many of these noble houses were among the most powerful in the region, and the total value of their plundered riches was estimated to exceed 100,000 gold dragons. Even Jon Arryn, Lord of the Vale, would struggle to produce such a sum on short notice. While this fortune was insignificant compared to the vast wealth of houses Lannister and Tyrell, it was more than enough to pay the army's wages for at least 10 days, leaving a sizable surplus after accounts were settled. In a grand display of generosity, Robert distributed all these riches as rewards to the coalition's soldiers and lords. A king who was not short on gold, such a thing was rare indeed. Rather than diminishing due to the early setbacks in his campaign, Robert's reputation had only grown stronger. After bestowing honors and rewards upon the battle's greatest hero, Sir Brynden Blackfish Tully, the second hero of the war, Aegor was called to stand at the center of the tent. This time not only was Robert smiling at him, but the rulers of the 6 kingdoms seated around the tent also watched him with interest. For the sharp-eyed politicians among them, it was clear that the fragile peace between the 7 kingdoms was on the verge of collapse. If war were to break out once more, having a man skilled in strategy and planning could tip the scales of victory. And this was no ordinary strategist. Aegor was the central figure in a legendary adventure, a warrior who had fought the famed Red Viper of Dorne for dozens of rounds without falling. A man of both wisdom and martial prowess, his mere presence in a faction would serve as a rallying force for allies and a deterrent to enemies. It was a pity then that he was bound by oath to the Night's Watch. No one could recruit him. White Walker Slayer, Robert bellowed, clearly fond of the title he had bestowed upon Aegor. Perhaps he simply thought it sounded impressive. Sir Blackfish may have led the way to the Bloody Gate, but your ideas were indispensable in this victory. Name your reward so long as it isn't too outrageous. I swear as king that I shall grant it. A promise from Robert Baratheon. The words were spoken with the arrogance of a conqueror, but from his mouth they carried undeniable weight. The once lively tent fell silent in an instant. All eyes turned to the young man clad in black standing at the center of the gathering. What would a sworn brother of the Night's Watch desire? Outside the tent, the raucous cheers of reveling soldiers echoed through the curtains, starkly contrasting with the tense silence inside. Under the watchful eyes of countless nobles, Aegor's body trembled slightly. He hadn't expected Robert to distribute rewards in this make-a-wish fashion, leaving him unprepared. Your Grace, please release me from my vows as a brother of the Night's Watch. The words almost escaped his lips, but reason held him back at the last moment. Would such a request be too outrageous for Robert? Aegor couldn't say for certain, but he knew the king had the power to grant it. If Robert declared him a free man and a citizen of the 7 kingdoms, Jeor Mormont wouldn't dare openly object. But how would Eddard Stark react? As hand of the king, he had the authority to challenge royal decrees, and from a legal standpoint, while a king could legitimize a bastard, he had no right to absolve a sworn brother of the Night's Watch from his vows. That had been the rule for 1,000 years. If End insisted on upholding tradition, Robert would have no legal ground to stand on. Even if the king's will ultimately overpowered the hand's principles, Aegor would forever be at odds with End Stark, a dangerous position for any man in the 7 kingdoms. And then, what of the Night's Watch Industries? If he were freed, there would be no justification for him to continue managing the fledgling manufacturing and financial empire he had built under the Watch's banner. Mormont could appoint someone else to seize control of all its assets. End Stark, in his unwavering sense of justice, might even assist in preventing Aegor from transferring any of its wealth. Beyond that, on a personal level, Aegor had grown accustomed to life as a Night's Watchman, particularly the privileges that came with his unique position as chief logistics officer. He never had to fight on the battlefield, a luxury few men could claim in an era where life was as cheap as dirt, not under the jurisdiction of any lord, not bound to anyone's will, not subject to any orders. Anyone with an ounce of intelligence could see how much power such a position held. He might wear the black and carry an oath, but the privileges he wielded were far more valuable than a mere citizenship that held no real influence. As things stood, he was the only man in the 7 kingdoms who could carve out his own path purely through his own merit, free from noble birth or family ties. Throw all of that away and start over. The thought alone was unbearable. If he abandoned his Night's Watch identity, how many years of struggle and risk would it take before he could once again stand among the real power players of Westeros, drinking and laughing with knights and lords, or sitting face to face with a king? What? Robert, though impatient, was noticeably softer toward Aegor than he had been in their last war council. After all, this was the man who had saved his honor. If you can't decide right away, sit down, have some wine and meat, and tell me when you've made up your mind. No, your grace, I've already decided. Aegor raised his head, forcing down the mix of excitement and nervousness. You said I could ask for anything without limit on quantity. Well, no, but it can't be too outrageous. Let's set a limit, 3 requests, as long as they don't break the law or violate your Night's Watch oath. I only need 2. Aegor felt a surge of relief. He had prepared only 1 true request, but the second was a necessary pretext, a cover to make his real demand seem more reasonable. First, the Alchemist's Guild in King's Landing has, by your command, safeguarded the wildfire left over from the previous dynasty. In the warm south, such a thing is dangerous, but in the cold and desolate north, it could be a stable and effective weapon. I ask your grace to order the guild to relocate the wildfire stores from King's Landing to the wall, leaving only a few assistants to oversee them, while the pyromancers, those skilled in its preparation, are sent to the Night's Watch to produce and supply this weapon for the defense of the realm. Write that down, Robert exhaled in relief, glancing at his scribe. So long as it wasn't about gold, he had no objections. What's the second request? There are over 100,000 wildlings beyond the wall, restless and in need of aid. However, the Iron Throne, Aegor hesitated, knowing he couldn't say outright that the crown was broke. Robert would take offense. Instead, he softened his words. Is unable to provide the necessary support. The Night's Watch understands your grace's difficulties, so we have chosen to be self-sufficient. Through the logistics department I established, we have begun raising funds, purchasing supplies, and training new recruits in King's Landing through our own efforts. Many in the tent were already aware of the Night's Watch's growing industries. Even Robert himself had heard bits and pieces. After all, every book sold in Westeros, even the cheap brothel pamphlets, bore the same tiny imprint on the back, produced by the Night's Watch. Well, go on. But one thing frustrates me, Aegor continued, his tone measured. Despite our efforts, all business ventures that provide logistical support to the Night's Watch are taxed by the Iron Throne just like ordinary merchants. The crown is meant to fund the Watch in its defense against the White Walkers, yet instead the money we work tirelessly to earn is being drained back into the kingdom's coffers instead of going toward the wall's defense. All right, Robert waved a hand impatiently. The Night's Watch's purchases of food and arms, oh damn it all, never mind. From now on, all Night's Watch activities within the 7 kingdoms are tax-exempt. Gasps rippled through the assembled lords. Robert, who had not yet drunk himself into a stupor, suddenly realized something was amiss. Wait, no names allowed. Only sworn brothers of the Night's Watch, men who have taken the oath and stood atop the wall, can be exempt, your grace. Sir Barristan Selmy, standing beside the king, finally spoke up. As a Kingsguard, he had a duty to advise his liege against reckless decisions. Rules exist to prevent exploitation. If you set such a vague condition, what's to stop men from taking the oath, standing on the wall for a few days, and then returning to claim lifetime tax exemption? Within a decade, every merchant in the realm will become a Night's Watchman. Robert frowned, realizing the flaw in his decree. But he was Robert Baratheon, and a king who had spoken boldly could not back down without losing face. Forget it, White Walker Slayer, the exemption applies only to you. Only you personally will be free from taxation. Your grace, Barristan looked exasperated. The restriction seemed harsh at first glance, but in reality it was still a loophole large enough to drive a cart through. It wouldn't take 10 years. Under Aegor's leadership, the Night's Watch could funnel vast amounts of wealth through his personal exemption. Complete tax immunity had no place in a feudal system. Enough, no more talk. Robert, ever the hot-tempered warrior, had grown tired of the debate. He paused, then threw back his drink, sloshing wine from his cup. White Walker Slayer, I'm warning you, this privilege is for you alone.
Author's note. This chapter is where victory meets consequence. Aegor's plan unfolds flawlessly, yet the battlefield proves that luck, timing, and the unseen hand of others shape war as much as strategy does. Here, triumph is shared, rewards are bestowed, and the seeds of influence are sown not through steel alone, but through foresight, negotiation, and calculated boldness.
You are forbidden from passing it on or letting others benefit from it. If you push your luck, I'll take it back. Setting a vague bottom line, much like reserving the right of final interpretation, was, at the very least, a meaningful restriction. Barristan Selmy sighed but chose not to challenge Robert's temper any further. All right, get out of here. Robert sounded slightly irritated, but today was a day of celebration. He downed the rest of his wine, and the alcohol quickly dulled his frustration. Next, Rob, what do you want? Don't dawdle like the one before you. Thank you, your grace. Aegor suppressed his excitement and returned to his seat. His original goal had been to secure tax exemptions for the Night's Watch factories, but he had ended up receiving something far greater: tax exemption privileges for himself. With this in hand, as long as Mormont remained clear-headed, Aegor would never have to worry about being sidelined or recalled. As for the supposed restrictions, in the future, he would simply have to travel frequently to apply his personal tax-free status to the ever-growing Night's Watch industries. He might not yet be among the most powerful figures in the 7 kingdoms, but he would soon be one of the most valuable. As he settled back into his seat, a familiar, beautiful young woman raised her glass toward him. Marguerite Tyrell had not been present for the war council. Women were not permitted to attend, but the victory feast was a different matter. She smiled, her gaze appreciative. The chief logistics officer is truly impressive. I admire you, Aegor grinned. Likewise, but compared to tax exemptions, those who collect taxes, such as the Tyrells, are the real winners here. He could barely contain his pride. So long as he didn't abuse his privileges, Robert's personality meant he would never revoke them, even if he later regretted granting them. The only common-born man in the grand tent had become the center of attention among the Seven Kingdoms' nobility. Those who merely spent gold rarely understood its true worth. But the lords who managed tax collection, the heads of noble houses, treasurers, and regional rulers knew exactly what Aegor's tax exemption really meant. They weren't envious, but they couldn't deny it. This young Night's Watchman had pulled off something remarkable. So many eyes were fixed on Aegor that few paid attention when Robb Stark stepped forward to claim his own reward. But then, with a single sentence, the young wolf commanded the entire tent's attention. The once muted hall erupted into cheers, gasps, and confused whispers. Aegor nearly choked on his wine. He had thought Cersei was the biggest winner of this war. Just moments ago, he had been certain of it. But now, he realized there was someone else. Robb Stark knelt on one knee before Robert, took a deep breath, and declared, I have fallen in love with Rosalind Frey, daughter of Lord Walder Frey, at first sight. Your Grace, please grant me your hand in marriage. Aegor coughed, wiping his mouth after nearly choking on his wine. His gaze instinctively turned to Rosalind Frey's brother, a man old enough to be her grandfather. The eldest son of Walder Frey had gone from shock to outright delight, clear proof that this good news had been entirely Robb Stark's decision, without prior discussion with the bride's family. The northern lords Karstark, Umber, and the others frantically signaled their young lord to withdraw his request, but Robb did not even glance their way. His eyes remained locked on the King of the Seven Kingdoms, awaiting an answer. Robert's expression darkened. As a close friend of Robb's father and the head of House Baratheon, he was far from pleased with this choice of bride. The Freys were not worthy of the Starks. This was an undeniable fact in the eyes of the Seven Kingdoms. And Robb wasn't just any Stark, he was the heir of Winterfell. If his godson truly wanted to secure his power and forge a lasting peace in the realm, he should have married that cunning girl from House Tyrell, binding the North and the Reach together. That said, a king's promise was not given lightly. While the match wasn't ideal, at least it posed no threat to the stability of the Iron Throne. Robert quickly composed himself and turned to the Frey representative sent to negotiate on behalf of the family. Stevron, can you make this decision in your father's name? Of course not. Walder Frey had always been the sole authority in his family, but Stevron knew that if he dared refuse, his father would have his hide the moment he returned home. Yes, your grace, Stevron declared without hesitation. On behalf of House Frey, I accept this marriage. Good. Robert's earlier irritation faded, replaced by amusement. He had never officiated a wedding before, and now that things had taken this turn, he saw no reason not to enjoy it. Since we have lords from all over the Seven Kingdoms gathered here, why wait for another day? Let the mountains of the Vale and the nobles of Westeros bear witness. Someone bring me a septon. Robb, straighten up. You're getting married tonight. A Frey knight immediately rushed out of the tent to fetch the bride, while inside, the atmosphere erupted into chaos. Several northern lords quickly surrounded Robb, their faces tense as they spoke in hushed but urgent tones, clearly objecting to the match. But they were soon drowned out by the swelling tide of congratulations, some cheering for the young wolf's good fortune and love, others praising the Freys for securing such a powerful match. The shift from tense silence to deafening celebration happened so fast that even Aegor was momentarily stunned. Robb's parents didn't even know about this, yet here was Robert throwing a wedding for their son on the spot. Coming from him, it actually makes perfect sense. Of course, a king had the authority to grant marriages, but only with the consent of the involved parties and their families. When the Mad King had appointed Jaime Lannister to the Kingsguard, Jaime had considered it an honor at first, but Tywin had taken it as a personal insult and turned against the crown. Robert might seem reckless, but he knew exactly where the line was. He would never arrange marriages for major vassals like Robb or Margaery without their family's consent. That would be inviting disaster. But this was different. Robb had made the request himself. Robert was merely giving him what he asked for. If Eddard and Catelyn Stark were furious when they heard the news, that was Robb's problem, not his. And as for the Freys, they could celebrate in silence. Who has the time to care what they think? Aegor rubbed his temple. Some men can't even control their own hair, how can they be expected to control anything else? That said, if Robb had to marry someone, this was certainly a better choice than some random noblewoman or an insignificant girl whose name Aegor could never remember. At the very least, the Red Wedding will never happen now. Still, he couldn't help but pity Robb's father. Eddard Stark was an exception, a man with an unusual sense of morality and self-discipline. But in this world where gender equality was non-existent and nobles and commoners lived in entirely different spheres, virtues like chastity, fidelity, and monogamy were not the qualities most valued by the Stark bloodline. Aegor, raised in modern values, might condemn the irresponsibility of such behavior. But from a lord's perspective, from a father's perspective, A man like Eddard who tried to raise his son with strict moral boundaries was only increasing the likelihood that Robb would rebel. If Eddard had instead let his son indulge early, taken him to a few brothels, taught him the real rules of the nobility, made him understand that women are like clothes but vassals are like brothers, then perhaps Robb wouldn't be so easily swept away by a pretty face making impulsive decisions that disregarded the interests of his house. "Your Grace," a voice finally broke through the noise. A knight stepped forward hesitantly. "Should we not, at the very least, inform the hand of the king before proceeding with the wedding?" "Damn you, Kingsguard," Robert bellowed. "They call you Barristan the Bold, but I think Barristan the Killjoy suits you better. Now take this jug of wine and get out of my sight. Don't come back until you've finished it." The old knight in white armor stood still for a few moments, casting a glance over the chaotic feast before him. With a sigh, he took the jug of wine from Robert's hand and silently left the tent. A few minutes later, Rosalind Frey, Robb's bride, whom Aegor had been curious to see, arrived, escorted by her family. The atmosphere inside the tent, already lively, erupted into full-blown revelry. Many of the gathered lords had seen Rosalind Frey before, but tonight, under the flickering firelight and against the backdrop of her rather unfortunate-looking relatives, she appeared even more striking. Her light-colored gown hugged her slender frame, making her fair skin glow with a delicate radiance. Dark chestnut hair cascaded in loose curls down her back, framing a face of delicate beauty. But it was her eyes, large and brown, shimmering with nervousness and a hint of mystery beneath the candlelight, that drew the most attention. Even the stern northern lords, who had initially shown little enthusiasm, found themselves swept up in the moment. Though her status was not ideal, her beauty more than compensated. Few could object to such a woman becoming the future Lady of Winterfell. "She truly is a beauty. Even I'm a little moved," came a voice beside Aegor. It might have been inappropriate to comment on another man's bride in such a way, but coming from Margaery Tyrell, it was merely playful banter. Aegor couldn't simply ignore it, so he raised his cup, glanced at Rosalind, and nodded in agreement. Rosalind, blushing shyly, was nudged into Robb's arms. Robert, grinning broadly, loudly declared the wedding's commencement. The lords and knights banged their cups against the tables in celebration. The Septon had yet to arrive, but no one cared for such details. Rosalind Frey was undeniably beautiful, but Aegor, who had lived in a world of Photoshop and cosmetic surgery, had long since developed a certain immunity to beauty. After a brief appreciation, he looked away. Margaery, observing him with interest, suddenly asked, "The Night's Watch forbids marriage. What do you think when you see women? Just because I can't marry doesn't mean I can't touch." Of course, he couldn't answer the scheming little Rose so bluntly. Instead, he channeled Benjen Stark's solemn demeanor and replied with a straight face, "We take responsibility as wives and honor as concubines." Tusk, Margaery rarely dropped her refined facade, but this time she actually rolled her eyes, pouting in mock displeasure. She stared at him, clearly annoyed. She had been making idle conversation, and yet this black-clad Night's Watchman had responded with such a stiff, humorless answer. "You're no fun at all." Realizing he had been too cautious, Aegor quickly softened his tone. He smiled and said, "There are no women at the wall. I get nervous when speaking with a lady as refined as you, Lady Margaery. If I have offended you, I ask for your forgiveness." HMPH, Margaery sighed in mild frustration. She had traveled so far north and had yet to accomplish half of what she set out to do. Now even her conversation partner was proving difficult. She no longer had the patience for small talk, so she simply turned her head away and stopped engaging with him. From the moment Robb had asked for his marriage, Aegor had gone from being a center of attention to just another spectator. But it was still unwise to ignore a noblewoman entirely. "It's too loud in here. My head is starting to ache. I'll excuse myself," he said politely before slipping out of the tent. Talking to a beautiful woman was pleasant enough, but Aegor was a practical man. Margaery Tyrell was never going to be his lover, and every conversation with her was a carefully measured game. If he let his guard down for even a moment, he might walk into one of her traps. It was exhausting. Better to just avoid the risk altogether. Outside the tent, the sounds of raucous celebration continued, but at least it was quieter than inside. The moonlight and the glow of scattered campfires cast long shadows across the field. That was when Aegor noticed Sir Barristan Selmy. The old knight sat on a low bench a few feet from the entrance, still clad in his white cloak and armor. In his hands was the jug of fine wine Robert had gifted him. He drank slowly, his once imposing figure slightly hunched, his silhouette seeming far lonelier than before. Does he actually intend to finish the whole jug before returning, or was he simply drowning his sorrows? Even though Barristan had tried to ruin his plans earlier, Aegor still respected the man's unwavering integrity and unmatched skill. There was never harm in forming a connection with someone as formidable as Sir Barristan Selmy. Sir Selmy, Sir West. The old Kingsguard turned and under the moonlight saw Aegor's face clearly for the first time. Though they were not acquainted, Barristan respected those who were loyal to their duty, and Aegor's dedication to the Night's Watch earned him some measure of regard. The old knight did not ignore his words. "Why aren't you inside for the wedding?" Strictly speaking, addressing Aegor as Sir was incorrect. As a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, he had renounced all former titles and could never reclaim them. In the eyes of the law, a Night's Watchman was no different from a commoner, regardless of his rank within the order. Yet, after months away from the wall, Aegor no longer bothered correcting people when they called him Sir or Lord, as he had once done upon leaving Castle Black. The reality was simple: people like Margaery Tyrell and Barristan Selmy had little interaction with commoners. If Aegor denied being a Sir, what would they call him? Besides, the resources and influence he now controlled far surpassed that of an ordinary knight or even a lesser lord. He could afford to accept such courtesy without protest. "It's just a farce," Aegor said. "You don't approve of this marriage either, do you?" "Who the heir of House Stark weds is none of my concern," Barristan replied, shaking his head. "What I oppose is his Grace's way of handling things. Marriage determines the future of a noble house. It should never be treated as a jest. A wedding arranged without even informing the groom's parents, it's absurd. In terms of spectacle, this is no mere joke. Apart from a royal wedding, when else could so many of the realm's lords be gathered in one place?" "What good are all these guests if the groom's parents aren't among them?" Barristan countered. "What happens when you return to King's Landing and the hand of the king refuses to recognize this marriage? Will Robb Stark be expected to pack up his bride and send her back to the twins? Lord Eddard is an honorable man. He would never do something so disgraceful." Aegor considered for a moment. "And as for rejecting the marriage entirely, that seems unlikely. Tell me, how many non-ducal houses in all of Westeros are as wealthy and powerful as House Frey?" Rhetorical questions were typically meant to imply a negative answer. But as Barristan pondered, he realized Aegor's point had merit. "In the north there's House Manderley of White Harbor," Barristan mused. "In the Vale, never mind, after the Righteous League fiasco they're in shambles. In the Westerlands there are certainly wealthy houses, but none with significant power. Lord Tywin has made sure of that. In the Stormlands and Dorne, the harsh conditions prevent any non-ducal houses from rising too high. And in the Reach, there's House Hightower of Oldtown and House Redwyne of the Arbor, both as rich and powerful as the Freys, if not more so, and certainly more prestigious. The Manderleys are already Stark loyalists. Marrying their heir to them would be a wasted alliance," Aegor reasoned. "The Westerlands, Stormlands, and Dorne aren't worth discussing. As for Oldtown and the Arbor, their influence is undeniable. But tell me, where are their lands? In the southwestern corner of Westeros, thousands of leagues from the north. If trouble arises, what aid could they possibly provide? Such an alliance would be meaningless. There's a reason people say befriend distant lands, strike nearby foes." He shifted his tone slightly, pressing his point. "But the Freys, they control the key crossing between the north and the rest of the realm. They have wealth, troops, and a strategic location. A marriage alliance with them would not only increase the North's available forces by a tenth, but it would also extend their influence southward by hundreds of miles. The Starks would grow stronger, and at the same time it would stabilize House Tully's hold over the Riverlands. Two birds, one stone. Why wouldn't they do it?" "That's a fair argument." Barristan gestured toward the flask of wine Robert had bestowed upon him. "Come, have a drink. If we're speaking purely of wealth and military strength, the twins is a valuable ally. But House Frey's history is short, and they've never produced any heroes or great men. Their reputation as nouveau rich does them no favors." "Thank you." Aegor took a seat beside the old knight and accepted the offered flask, taking a long drink. The wine was strong, but the brewing methods of this era were still primitive. It was more an alcoholic beverage than a true spirit. Short history. The North is filled with houses that have existed for 1,000 years, but most of them combined still don't match Lord Walder's power. And does anyone send their daughters to them just because of their history? He smirked. "As for being upstarts, tell me, sir, who is the biggest upstart in Westeros right now? 300 years of history, not even half of House Frey's. But so long as he sits on the Iron Throne, who would dare call him an upstart to his face? The bigger the fist, the greater the truth. House Frey may have a poor reputation, but after tonight, as kin to the Starks, they will no longer be mocked. They will be a great house in all but name." Aegor hadn't spoken the name outright, but Barristan knew exactly whom he meant. Comparing House Frey to House Baratheon, it was a bold statement. Yet despite himself, Barristan found Aegor's perspective compelling. His logic was cold, pragmatic, and difficult to refute. The old knight could have argued further, but deep down he felt any counterpoint would be weak. He chuckled instead. "I won't argue with you, but if what you say is true, then surely House Stark, being a ducal house, should have secured an even stronger match. If you could choose freely which lord's daughter would have been the best choice for Robb." Now that was a mistake. If this had been a formal debate, Barristan had just walked straight into Aegor's trap. He had already considered this question long ago. In truth, Robb faced the same dilemma as Edmure Tully. Unless his grace is willing to betroth Princess Michella to Robb, he only has two viable choices, Aegor said smoothly. "A marriage to Dorne is unlikely. They're far to the south, and I doubt they would send one of their own to the freezing north. That leaves only one option." He smirked. "Margaery Tyrell is in that tent. If you're so curious, why don't you go in and ask her if she'd be willing to marry Robb?" Barristan coughed awkwardly but said nothing. "Thank you for your concern, Chief Logistics Officer, but my marriage is not something you need to worry about." A soft, lilting voice interrupted their conversation, making Aegor stiffen in surprise. He turned to find Margaery standing behind him. "Sir, you wear the black, yet you seem to know everything about the Vale and the Seven Kingdoms. How curious." Aegor exhaled, masking his momentary embarrassment. He hadn't even noticed her approach. Between the revelry in the camp and his conversation with Barristan, he had been completely unaware. Fortunately, he hadn't spoken ill of her. He forced a casual tone. As the Night's Watch's chief logistics officer, it is my duty to secure supplies and funding from the realm's lords. Naturally, I must learn everything I can about them. Of course, Aegor's understanding of Westeros didn't come solely from watching plays and reading books before his arrival in this world. After reaching King's Landing, he had relied on Tyrion's introductions and various documents to develop a thorough grasp of the Seven Kingdoms' political landscape. Even so, no matter how much knowledge he accumulated, he could never match Margaery. Born into nobility and with access to far more sources of information. HMPH, the girl rolled her eyes at him and said no more. The notion that ignoring a wealthy and beautiful woman would somehow intrigue her or even make her fall in love was a pure fantasy. Rich and beautiful women aren't that bored. Margaery turned away from Aegor and instead directed her attention to Barristan Selmy. She dipped into a graceful bow. Sir Selmy. Barristan the Bold, or perhaps Barristan the Spoilsport. Though Robert had been rude when he scolded him, Barristan Selmy remained one of the king's most trusted men as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. It wasn't just Aegor who wished to cultivate a relationship with a man so deeply embedded in the heart of power, someone who could influence the king's thinking at any time. Lady Margaery. Barristan smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. In the past, as the king's personal guard and advisor, he had always been careful not to engage too much with non-royal nobles, avoiding any hint of improper influence. But after his recent conversation with Aegor about the marriage politics of Westeros, he found himself in an uncharacteristically social mood. "Forgive me if my question is intrusive," he said, "but my lady, have you chosen a husband?" Highgarden had long set its sights on the crown. As the most powerful noble house in the Seven Kingdoms, second only to House Lannister, the Tyrells had been biding their time ever since the end of Robert's rebellion, waiting for the king's son to come of age. The Queen of Thorns had spent years molding Margaery into the perfect candidate, not only beautiful but politically astute, raised with one clear purpose: to become the mother of a kingdom. With Highgarden's wealth and influence, securing such a match was entirely possible. All it required was a well-timed display of loyalty, a generous dowry, and enough patience to outmaneuver any rivals. If they played their cards right, the Tyrells would secure the throne not through war but through marriage. Margaery had every reason to be confident. She had spent years cultivating relationships, forging alliances within the court, and slowly building the support needed for when Robert would inevitably declare he was seeking a queen for Joffrey. When that moment arrived, she would step forward and claim victory without contest. But then Jon Arryn died. The hand of the king who had quietly signaled his support for Margaery's match was gone. Before the Tyrells could even react, Robert had traveled north, and within days of reaching Winterfell, he had arranged Joffrey's betrothal to Sansa Stark. No warning, no formal courtship, no opportunity for Margaery to even compete. The most impulsive man in Westeros had, in a matter of days, undone over a decade of careful planning. She hadn't lost to a rival house nor to a scheming noblewoman. She had lost to a girl who had done nothing. She wanted to protest. Imagine preparing for years, laying the groundwork, training relentlessly, only to be told that the event had been cancelled before you even had the chance to sign up. The world had shifted too fast, and her careful strategies had failed to keep pace. There were only two choices: adapt or be left behind. Margaery was not one to accept defeat. If she couldn't be a queen, she would find another way to power. She had pivoted quickly, using the rebellion in the Vale as an opportunity to attach herself to Robert instead. If she could not sit the throne as a queen, she would stand beside it as a mistress. It wasn't ideal, but it was a way forward. And yet, for the first time in his life, Robert Baratheon, the man known for his legendary appetites, had refused to take the bait. Margaery had tried everything. She wasn't Lyanna Stark, but she was beautiful enough by anyone's standards. She was skilled, charming, and trained in all the arts of seduction. So why had Robert rejected her? Was my little Rose not sweet enough? Or is it that the king has suddenly developed high standards? She had exhausted every trick her grandmother had taught her, but Robert had remained unmoved. It was only after her relentless persistence that he had finally offered a suggestion one she had never expected. Go to Robb Stark. At first she had dismissed the idea, but as time passed she had come to see the truth. House Tyrell was rich, powerful, and had vast armies, but none of that meant anything if the hand of the king was against them. Breaking Joffrey's betrothal was impossible. Undermining the Stark influence in King's Landing was even harder. The only path forward was the one Robert had given her. She could no longer chase the crown, but the hand's power, that was still within reach. And so she had made her decision. By the time the night's celebrations ended, she would make her move, approaching Robb Stark under the pretense of congratulations, admiration, and goodwill. This time she would not wait for an invitation. This time she would strike first. Becoming the hand of the king's daughter-in-law and the future Lady Stark would have been a roundabout path to power, but all roads ultimately led to King's Landing. Yet just moments ago, before the gathered nobles of the Seven Kingdoms and right in front of Margaery, Robb Stark had asked Robert for permission to marry Rosalind Frey. What went wrong? Was it that everything my grandmother taught me was outdated? Or is this world itself broken? I did nothing wrong, so why is everything going wrong? And yet, in the face of such a crushing setback, she had still managed to keep a polite smile, making small talk with the Night's Watch officer beside her as if nothing had happened. How much self-control and composure had that taken? And yet that damnable Night's Watchman had barely spoken to her, treating her with wary distance, like she was some kind of threat. If she had been holding a sword at that moment, Margaery truly felt she could have run him through. But a wise person does not act out of anger. Roses have thorns, but what use was a thorn against a man who could supposedly hold his own against the Red Viper for dozens of rounds without losing? Margaery had looked toward Robb, who had been grinning ear to ear, arms wrapped around his new bride. She needed to clear her head. So she too had left the tent. That was when she had stumbled upon two men, one clad in black, the other in white, drinking under the moonlight, discussing politics and the state of the realm. And then, to her astonishment, they had started talking about her. Would she be willing to marry Robb Stark? He's marrying a Frey. He'll be in the bridal chamber tonight. What's the point of asking me that now? Under the moonlit sky, the air seemed to freeze. Once again, silence fell upon the three of them, much like the uneasy quiet that had filled the tent earlier. Asking about someone's ideal partner was as impolite as asking a woman her age. It wasn't the sort of question that should be asked so directly, but to Aegor's surprise, Margaery answered without hesitation. My ideal man would be a hero, she said lightly. One day he would come to me wearing a crown and riding a white horse, calling me his queen of love and beauty. She let out a soft sigh. Unfortunately, it seems that will only ever be a foolish dream, just the wishful thinking of a poor girl no one wants. I see, Barristan said, his smile fading. He nodded but made no further comment. It was flawless. Aegor couldn't help but admire her skill. To answer so quickly, to turn the question to her advantage, to reveal just enough to seem open but not enough to give anyone any leverage over her, it was masterful. If she had remained silent, it would have seemed defensive, but if she had spoken too much, she might have made a misstep. Instead, she had offered an answer tinged with just the right amount of youthful longing and self-pity, one that was technically true, yet impossible to criticize. What's wrong with a 15-year-old girl dreaming of being a queen? Who would dare accuse her of being overly ambitious for that? Compared to his own awkward retreat from the feast, Margaery's response had been far more refined. Aegor quietly acknowledged her skill, but he had no idea just how bitter Margaery felt in that moment.
Author's note. This chapter is where ambition, cunning, and circumstance collide. Celebrations, masks, strategy, and even a single word can shift the balance of power. Here, influence is measured not by swords or armies alone, but by timing, foresight, and the ability to see opportunities others dismiss. This chapter ends here, but the nation lives on. More worlds and legends await on Fanfic Nation, where imagination rules and every story begins with a choice. Subscribe and return for the next legend.